The air in the penthouse was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and chilled champagne. It was one of those parties where the laughter was a little too loud and the smiles never quite reached the eyes. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city below, a sprawling carpet of lights that seemed to bow down to the height of the building. But no one was really looking at the view. They were looking at each other, or more accurately, they were looking at the man who owned it all. Julian Croft moved through the crowd like a shark through a glittering sea. He wasn't old, but he carried an air of ancient power, a confidence that came from knowing he could buy almost anything. He made his money in tech, something complicated with algorithms and data that most people didn't understand, which was exactly how he liked it. He didn't want friends. He wanted an audience. Tonight, his audience was a collection of actors, influencers, and business rivals, all vying for a moment of his attention. In a quiet corner, almost hidden by a large leafy plant, sat Elias. He was a musician, hired to add a touch of class to the evening. His guitar was a worn, trusted companion, its wood smoothed by years of practice. He played gentle, intricate melodies that flowed like a quiet river through the clamor of the party. Most people didn't even notice him. He was just part of the decor, like the marble statues or the abstract paintings on the wall. He was fine with that. He was there to do a job, to play his music, and to go home. Every note he played was a silent prayer, a wish for the money he was earning tonight to be enough. Enough for the rent, enough for groceries, and maybe, just maybe, enough to make a dent in the mountain of bills that waited for him. Julian Croft, however, had noticed him. He stood with a small group, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, and his gaze drifted over to the corner. A faint, dismissive smirk touched his lips. "It's pleasant, I suppose," he said, his voice just loud enough for his group to hear. "Like music for an elevator. It's harmless. It's safe." His followers chuckled, agreeing with him as they always did. He was bored. The party was predictable, the conversation dull. He needed something to happen, something he could control. He set his glass down on a passing waiter's tray and clapped his hands together twice. The sharp sound cut through the party noise, turning a few heads. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention for a moment?" The crowd gradually quieted, all eyes turning to him. He loved this feeling, this absolute command of the room. "We have some lovely music tonight, but I feel we could use something with a bit more challenge." He walked over to a tall, velvet-draped object that had been standing unnoticed by the main window. With a theatrical flourish, he grabbed the cord and pulled. The velvet fell away to reveal a truly bizarre instrument. It was shaped vaguely like a guitar, but seemed to have been put together by someone who had only ever heard a description of one. The wood was a dark, swirling grain, and it had too many strings, some of which looked thick as cables while others were thin as wire. The fretboard was slightly warped, and the tuning pegs were arranged in a seemingly random pattern. A collective murmur of confusion went through the room. "This," Julian announced, patting the strange object, "is called the dissonance. It was built by a mad genius. A recluse who believed modern music had become too simple, too easy on the ear. He designed this to be unplayable. 3 different concert virtuosos have tried. One of them reportedly burst into tears. Another threw it against a wall. It is a beautiful, glorious failure." He ran a hand lovingly along its strange curve. "And it is mine." His eyes scanned the room, and they landed once again on Elias. "You," he said, pointing a finger. The spotlight of attention, which had been on Julian, now shifted abruptly to the quiet musician in the corner. Elias felt his heart sink. He carefully placed his own guitar in its stand and stood up, feeling 100 pairs of eyes on him. He walked towards the center of the room, his worn shoes feeling soft and silent on the expensive rug. "You seem to know your way around a string or two," Julian said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I'll bet you think you're pretty good." Elias didn't answer. He just stood there, his face a calm mask, but inside his mind was racing. He could feel the hostility radiating from the billionaire. This wasn't a compliment. It was the setup for a joke, and he was the punchline. "So here's my proposal," Julian continued, a predatory gleam in his eyes. A little wager to make the evening more interesting. He paused for effect, letting the tension build. I bet you $1 million that you cannot play a single recognizable song on this instrument. You have 1 week. Starting now. A gasp went through the crowd. $1 million. It was an absurd, insane amount of money. It was a number that didn't even feel real. People started whispering and laughing. They saw it as the ultimate entertainment, a rich man's cruel game. They looked at Elias, expecting him to laugh it off, to refuse, to be a good sport and play his part in the humiliation. Elias looked at the strange instrument. It looked back at him like a challenge. He thought of the stack of envelopes on his kitchen table, the ones with the red, final notice stamps. He thought of the tired voice of his sister on the phone that afternoon, talking about test results and treatment options that were just out of reach. He thought of the feeling of being small, of being powerless, of his quiet music being dismissed as harmless and safe. What did he have to lose? His dignity? He felt like he had already lost that just by being in this room, being treated like a pet. $1 million wasn't just money. It was a lifeline. It was hope. It was a future. He looked Julian Croft directly in the eye. The billionaire was smirking, so confident, so sure of his power. He saw Elias as a prop in his own show. He saw a poor musician who would be easily broken. I accept, Elias said. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear and steady. The laughter in the room died instantly. The smirk on Julian's face faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flicker of surprise. He hadn't expected that. He had expected a stammered refusal, a polite excuse. He had not expected this quiet, simple acceptance. Excellent, Julian recovered, his grin returning, though it was a little tighter now. My lawyer will draw up the papers. You have 1 week. He gestured towards the monstrous instrument. You can even take it with you. I want you to have plenty of time to fail. 2 of Julian's staff members carefully lifted the dissonance and carried it towards Elias. It looked heavy and awkward. Elias took it from them, the strange, cold wood feeling alien in his arms. He could feel the eyes of the entire room on him as he turned and walked towards the exit, his own trusted guitar forgotten in the corner. He was no longer part of the decor. He was the main event. And as the elevator doors closed, taking him away from the glittering lights and the judging eyes, he was left alone with the weight of $1 million bet and a beautiful, impossible instrument. The ride down in the elevator was the quietest Elias had ever experienced. The soft music and the polished walls felt like they were closing in on him. In his arms, the dissonance felt less like an instrument and more like a captive animal, something wild and unpredictable that he had no idea how to handle. When he stepped out into the cool night air, the city lights blurred, and the weight of what he had done settled squarely on his shoulders. $1 million. The words echoed in his head with each step he took towards the bus stop. It felt like a fantasy, a dream he was having while walking home. But the cold, heavy wood in his arms was very, very real. His apartment was a small, third-floor walk-up in a building that sighed with age. It was a world away from the sleek, sterile penthouse he had just left. The paint was peeling in a few corners and the windows were drafty, but it was his. It was the place where his music lived. He carefully placed the dissonance on the only clear spot on his living room floor, propping it up against a threadbare couch. It looked utterly alien there, a piece of impossible art in a room of simple, lived-in reality. His own guitar, leaning in its stand in the corner, suddenly looked plain and ordinary, like a friendly pet next to a wild beast. For a long time he just sat on the floor and stared at it. He traced the strange patterns in the wood with his eyes. He counted the strings, again 13 of them, an unlucky number. They were a mix of gut and steel, some thick as his pinky, others thin as a strand of hair. The tuning pegs were a puzzle, arranged in a way that made no sense. He felt a strange mix of fear and excitement. This was the kind of challenge he had never faced. It was terrifying, but it was also thrilling. Finally, he took a deep breath and pulled it into his lap. He closed his eyes, trying to remember how it felt to hold his own guitar, the familiar weight, the comfortable curve against his body. But this was different. It was awkward, unbalanced. He placed his fingers on the fretboard, his muscle memory trying to find a starting chord, a simple G or C. His fingers landed, and he strummed. The sound that came out was not a chord. It was a noise. A harsh, clanging, jarring mess of notes that fought each other, a sonic assault that made him flinch. It was like hitting a collection of metal pots and pans with a hammer. He tried again, adjusting his fingers. The result was the same, just a different kind of ugly. There was no harmony, no melody, no music. There was only dissonance. The first few days were a nightmare of frustration. Elias woke up early, his mind already racing with strategies, and stayed up late, his fingers aching and his head pounding. He tried everything he knew. He tried to tune it, but the strings seemed to resist any attempt at order. When he got one string to a note, he recognized the others would slip out of tune, as if they were conspiring against him. He tried playing with a pick, with his fingers, with a piece of cloth. Nothing worked. The sound was always a mess. He would play for an hour, take a break to walk around the small apartment to clear his head, and then try again. He'd make a cup of coffee, stare out the window at the brick wall of the next building, and feel the hope draining out of him. The $1 million felt like a joke, a cruel prank. He started to feel a deep resentment towards the instrument, towards its creator, and most of all, towards Julian Croft and his smug, confident smile. He could imagine the billionaire laughing about it, telling his friends how the poor musician was probably crying in his tiny apartment by the third day. His fingertips were raw. The skin was red and tender, and in a few places it had split open. Every time he pressed down on a string, a sharp pain shot through his hand. He wrapped his fingers in bandages, but it made it even harder to feel the frets. He was getting nowhere. The apartment, usually his sanctuary, started to feel like a prison cell. And the instrument was his warden. He knew he couldn't keep going like this. Brute force and his old techniques weren't working. He was trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. On the fourth day, exhausted and defeated, he put the instrument down and turned to his old laptop. He needed to understand his enemy. He typed the name of the instrument into the search bar. The dissonance. He found a few articles from obscure music magazines and a handful of forum posts on websites for luthiers and instrument collectors. The creator's name was Alistair Finch, a man described as a brilliant but deeply eccentric recluse. One article from the 1980s had a blurry black and white photo of Finch. He was a wild-looking man with intense eyes and a mess of white hair. In the interview, he talked about his belief that music had become too comfortable, too predictable. He wanted to build an instrument that would force musicians to unlearn everything they thought they knew. Elias read on, his heart sinking. He found posts from people who claimed to have known Finch or owned his other creations. They all said the same thing. His instruments were not meant to be played in the traditional sense. They were meant to be a dialogue. One post, written by a man who had owned a Finch-built keyboard, said, "You don't play it. You listen to it. You have to find its voice, not force your own onto it." He spent hours digging through digital archives. He found scanned pages of Finch's handwritten notes, filled with strange diagrams and philosophical ramblings about the geometry of sound. He read about the 3 professional musicians who had attempted to play the dissonance before him. A famous cellist had reportedly tried for a month and then quit, saying the instrument had a malevolent spirit. A rock guitarist had smashed one of Finch's earlier creations on stage out of pure frustration. The history of the instrument was a graveyard of failed ambitions. The weight of this history was immense. He wasn't just fighting the instrument. He was fighting the ghosts of every musician who had come before him and failed. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his sore eyes. The screen glowed in the dark room, illuminating his tired face. He felt a deep sense of despair. Who was he, a simple musician who played background music at parties, to think he could succeed where virtuosos had failed? His phone buzzed on the desk. It was his sister. He hesitated, not in the mood to talk, but he knew he had to answer. Her voice on the other end was tired but cheerful. She was asking about his week, if he'd had any good gigs. He lied, telling her he was busy with a new project, something challenging. He didn't have the heart to tell her the truth. As they talked, she mentioned a new treatment the doctors had discussed, something that showed a lot of promise but was, of course, very expensive. The hope in her voice was like a knife in his heart. After he hung up, he sat in silence for a long time. The despair was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. A flicker of anger. Not at the instrument, but at the situation. At the unfairness of a world where a man like Julian Croft could treat a human life as a party game, and where his sister's health depended on a sum of money so large it was almost mythical. He stood up and walked back to the instrument. He looked at it not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a puzzle to be understood. He remembered the words from the forum post. You have to find its voice. He sat back down, but this time he didn't try to play a song. He didn't even try to play a chord. He just closed his eyes and listened. He plucked a single string. It was a flat, dull thud. He plucked another. A sharp, whining buzz. He started to pluck them one by one, not trying to make music, just trying to get to know them. He spent the rest of the night doing this, just listening to the individual sounds, the weird vibrations, the strange harmonics that sometimes appeared when two strings were accidentally touched at the same time. He wasn't making music, but for the first time, he felt like he was having a conversation. It wasn't a pleasant conversation, but it was a start. The sun was starting to rise when he finally put the instrument down, his fingers throbbing, but his mind was clear. He hadn't found the answer, but he felt like he had finally learned the right question to ask. The days that followed settled into a new kind of rhythm. The frantic energy of the first few days was gone, replaced by a quiet, patient determination. Elias stopped looking at the clock. He stopped thinking about the deadline. His world shrank to the small space of his apartment and the strange, challenging presence of the dissonance. He would wake up, make coffee, and sit with the instrument for hours. Not as a guitarist trying to play, but as a student trying to learn, his new method was one of pure exploration. He would pluck a single string and listen to how it vibrated, how the sound decayed, how it seemed to talk to the other strings. He discovered that some strings, when left open, created a constant, low hum that was actually quite pleasant. It wasn't a note you'd find in a normal song, but it had a calming, meditative quality. He decided to call these the drone strings. He would tune them once, carefully, and then leave them alone. Letting their constant tone be the foundation for everything else, he started to experiment with his hands. He put his pick away. It felt too aggressive, too much like an attack. He tried using just his fingertips, which gave a soft, fleshy sound. Then he tried using his fingernails, which created a sharper, more defined tone. One afternoon, while trying to reach a particularly awkward string, his knuckle accidentally scraped against it. The sound was bright and percussive, like a tiny drum. He froze. He did it again, deliberately this time. Tap, 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 tap. It was a completely different way of making sound. He spent the rest of the day just tapping, creating complex rhythms on the strings and the wooden body of the instrument. The warped fretboard, which had been his greatest enemy, now became an ally. He could slide a knuckle along it, creating a smooth, eerie wail that was impossible on a normal straight-necked guitar. He was unlearning everything. All the rules of music theory, all the chord shapes and scales he had practiced for years, were becoming irrelevant. This instrument had its own rules, its own language. He was no longer a musician. He was a translator trying to decipher its strange dialect. The process was physically and emotionally draining. His back ached from hunching over the awkward shape. His fingers, now covered in a mix of calluses and small cuts, were in a constant state of dull pain. There were moments of deep frustration when a sound he had found the day before would be impossible to replicate. He would feel the old anger rising, the desire to just give up or smash the thing against the wall. But then he would think of his sister's voice, of the hope in it when she talked about the new treatment. He would think of Julian Croft's arrogant smirk. And he would take a deep breath, close his eyes, and start again, this time more gently, more patiently. He started to see the instrument not as a single entity, but as a collection of different instruments. The drone strings were a bagpipe. The tapped strings were a drum. The high, thin strings were a flute. The thick, low strings were a cello. His challenge was to make them all play together. One night, deep into the sixth day, he was exhausted. He had been at it for hours and his mind was foggy. He wasn't even trying to make music anymore. He was just sitting, letting his hands wander over the strings and wood. He was tapping out a simple rhythm with his right hand, a beat that felt like his own tired heart, thump, 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 with his left hand. He was just holding down one of the drone strings, feeling its vibration through the wood. As he sat there, half asleep, his left hand slipped. His fingers slid down the warped fretboard, pulling the taut string with it. A high, piercing note rose out of the drone, a sound that was both sad and beautiful. It was an accident, but it was perfect. His eyes snapped open. He did it again. He tapped the rhythm with his right hand on the instrument's body. He held the low drone string with his left, and then he slid his finger. The note rose, clear and haunting, hanging in the air for a moment before fading back into the hum of the drone. It wasn't a song from the radio. It wasn't a classical piece. It was a sound born from that moment, from his exhaustion, his struggle, and his strange connection with this impossible object. It was a sound that told a story. It was the sound of giving up and then finding a reason to keep going. A wave of emotion washed over him, so powerful it almost took his breath away. It wasn't the excitement of victory. It was a quiet, profound sense of peace. He had been fighting for so long, trying to force the world to fit into his small understanding of it. But here, in this small room, with this strange instrument, he had finally stopped fighting. He had started listening. He played for the rest of the night. He wasn't thinking anymore. His hands seemed to move on their own, guided by instinct. He combined the drone, the tapping, and the sliding notes. He found new sounds, new ways to make the instrument weep and sing. He wasn't playing at it anymore. He was playing with it. It was a conversation, a dance. As the first light of dawn began to creep into his apartment, painting the dusty walls a soft gray, he played one final, haunting melody. It started with the low, steady hum of the drone, a sound like the earth itself. Then a simple, tapped rhythm joined in, like a heartbeat. And over the top, a single, soaring note slid into existence, full of a sadness that was also full of hope. It was the sound of his journey, condensed into a few seconds of music. He let the final note hang in the air, vibrating until it was nothing more than a memory. He sat in the quiet room, the instrument resting in his lap, and he knew. He knew what he was going to play. It wouldn't be a recognizable song. It would be this. It would be the truth. He had tamed the dissonance not by breaking it, but by understanding it. And in doing so, he felt like he had finally understood a part of himself. The bet was no longer about the money. It was about this moment, this feeling. He was ready. The elevator ride back up felt different. A week ago, he had been a prisoner on his way to his own execution. Now he felt like a messenger. The weight of the dissonance in his arms was the same, but it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a purpose. He had wrapped it in an old, soft blanket, not out of shame, but out of respect, like a parent tucking in a child. He wore the same clothes he had worn to the party, a simple shirt and trousers. He hadn't thought about what to wear. It didn't matter. None of this was about appearances anymore. The penthouse doors slid open, and the scene was just as he had expected. It wasn't a full-blown party this time. The crowd was smaller, more curated. It was a gallery, and he was the exhibit. Julian had gathered his closest circle, the ones who enjoyed his power plays the most. The atmosphere was thick with a cruel, hungry anticipation. Champagne glasses were in hand, and the whispers were like the rustling of predators before a feeding. Julian stood in the center of the room, the picture of relaxed confidence. He had changed into a silk shirt, open at the collar, and he held a glass of whiskey as if it were a scepter. When he saw Elias, a wide, predatory smile spread across his face. "Ah, the challenger returns," he announced, his voice booming through the room. Come in, come in. Don't be shy. We're all eager to hear your progress." A few people chuckled. Elias ignored them. His eyes scanned the room and found a single stool placed in the middle of the floor, a spotlight already aimed at it. It was a stage for a sacrifice. He walked towards it, his steps calm and measured. The blanket around the instrument seemed to absorb the sound of the room, creating a small bubble of silence around him as he moved. He didn't look at Julian. He didn't look at the guests. He just walked to the stool, carefully unwrapped the dissonance, and propped it in his lap. The room fell silent, waiting for the first clumsy note, the first sign of failure. A man in a sharp suit, whom Elias recognized as the lawyer from a week ago, stood by a small table with a contract and a pen. "No need for a warm-up?" Julian asked, his voice dripping with mockery. "Please, don't let us hold you back. The clock is ticking?" Elias didn't answer. He just sat there for a long moment, his eyes closed. He wasn't praying or nervous. He was listening. He was listening to the quiet hum of the city outside the windows, to the faint buzz of the lights, and to the silence inside his own head. He was clearing a space for the music to live. Then he began. He didn't strum or pluck. He simply rested his hand on the instrument, and a low, deep hum filled the room. It was the drone string he had tuned, a note that felt ancient and solid, like the foundation of the world. The sound wasn't loud, but it was present. It settled in the air and in the chests of everyone listening. The whispers in the room died completely. A moment later, a new sound joined in. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping. Elias was using the knuckles of his right hand, drumming a gentle, steady beat against the wooden body of the instrument. Thump, thump, thump. It was a heartbeat. A simple human rhythm in the middle of all this cold, technological luxury. The guests exchanged confused glances. This wasn't the cacophony they had expected. It was intriguing. Julian's smile had tightened. He leaned forward, his brow furrowed slightly. This wasn't part of the script, and then Elias slid his finger. A single, high-pitched note rose out of the drone, a sound that was both sharp and sorrowful. It didn't sound like it came from a string. It sounded like a voice, a human cry, echoing in a vast empty space. It slid up, wavering with emotion, and then slowly fell back into the deep hum of the drone. A woman in the back of the room let out a small, audible gasp. The spell was cast. Elias was no longer in the penthouse. He was back in his small apartment in the early hours of the morning, discovering the soul of the instrument. And he was taking everyone with him. He began to weave the sounds together. The steady heartbeat of the tapping never stopped. The deep drone was a constant presence. And over the top he told a story with the sliding notes. Sometimes the notes were frantic and desperate, racing up and down the fretboard like a person running from a monster. Sometimes they were slow and mournful, weeping with a sadness so pure it was painful to hear. He wasn't playing a song. He was playing a feeling. He was playing the week of his life. The frustration, the despair, the anger, the flicker of hope, and the final, quiet peace. The music was raw and honest, stripped of all pretense. It was the most real thing anyone in that room had ever heard. The camera, if there had been one, would have panned across the faces of the guests. The smirks were gone. The cynical amusement had been replaced by something else. Awe, confusion. A few people had tears in their eyes. They had come to watch a man be humiliated, but instead, they were being humbled by his art. But the most important reaction was happening in the center of the room. Julian Croft was frozen. The glass of whiskey was forgotten in his hand. His face, which had been a mask of confident control, was now a canvas of conflicting emotions. First there was confusion. He couldn't understand what he was hearing. This wasn't music in the way he understood it. It was something more primal, something he couldn't categorize or own. Then came disbelief. He looked from Elias's hands, moving with an impossible grace, to the faces of his guests who were completely captivated. This wasn't failure. This was triumph. The word formed in his mind and felt like a poison. The disbelief slowly, terrifyingly, turned into a dawning horror. He was not going to win. He was going to lose. He was going to lose $1 million. But it was more than that. He had set up this game to prove his power, to show that money could buy anything and crush anyone. He had wanted to break this man, to make him an example. But the man on the stool wasn't broken. He was whole. He was using the very instrument Julian had bought as a symbol of his own superiority to create something that made Julian's entire world feel small and cheap. The power was shifting, and he was powerless to stop it. The music reached its peak. The tapping became more urgent, the sliding notes a desperate, soaring plea. It was the sound of a man on the edge, crying out into the darkness. And then, slowly, it began to calm. The frantic rhythm softened. The sliding notes became gentler, more hopeful. The heartbeat slowed. Finally, Elias played one last, long, beautiful note that hung in the air like a star. It was a sound of acceptance, of peace. He let it fade until all that was left was the deep, steady hum of the drone. And then, with a final, gentle touch, he silenced that too. The silence that followed was heavier and more profound than any sound. It was a sacred space. No one moved. No one breathed. It was as if they were all afraid to break the spell. Then, from the back of the room, someone started to clap. It was a single, hesitant clap at first. Then another joined in. And another. Within seconds, the silence was shattered by a thunderous wave of applause. It wasn't polite, formal clapping. It was loud, emotional, and spontaneous. People were on their feet cheering for the man they had come to see fail. Elias slowly opened his eyes. He looked out at the standing ovation, but he didn't seem to see it. He gently placed the dissonance back in its blanket. His work was done. And in the center of the room, Julian Croft stood alone. His face was pale, his knuckles white where he gripped his glass. The applause washed over him, but it wasn't for him. He was a king who had just been overthrown in his own castle, and the only sound he could hear was the roaring in his own ears. He was confident no more. The thunderous applause felt like a physical thing, a wave of sound that pressed against Elias's skin. But for him, the real music had already been played. He sat on the stool, the strange, silent instrument in his lap, and felt a profound sense of quiet. He had done what he set out to do. He had spoken the truth of the past week, and it seemed, for a moment, that everyone in the room had understood. He slowly and carefully wrapped the dissonance in its old blanket. Treating it with the same gentle respect he would show a friend, the applause began to die down. And the guests slowly returned to the present moment. They looked at each other, their faces flushed with emotion, as if waking from a shared dream. All eyes then turned to the center of the room, to the man who had made the wager. The silence that fell this time was different. It was not the sacred silence after the music, but a tense, awkward silence. Heavy with expectation, Julian Croft stood frozen. The color had drained from his face, leaving it pale and slack. The confident smirk was gone, replaced by a look of utter disbelief. He looked like a man who had built a fortress only to discover it was made of sand. He had lost control of the room, of the narrative, of himself. His lawyer, a man with a face like stone, stepped forward and whispered something in his ear. Julian gave a short, sharp nod, his eyes still fixed on Elias. With a movement that looked stiff and unnatural, Julian walked towards the small table where the contract lay. His steps were heavy, as if he were walking through mud. The crowd parted for him, their expressions a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. He picked up an expensive pen, his hand trembling slightly. The only sound in the room was the scratching of the pen on the paper as he wrote out the check. It was a sound of defeat, a sound that was louder than any applause. He walked over to Elias, holding the check out like a piece of rotten meat. He couldn't meet Elias's eyes. "A deal's a deal," he said, his voice a low, guttural rasp. It was the voice of a man who was choking on his own pride. Elias took the check. He didn't look at it. He just folded it neatly and put it in his pocket. He looked at the broken man in front of him, not with triumph, but with a strange sense of pity. "Thank you," Elias said, his voice quiet but clear. There was no gloating in his tone, no "I told you so." It was a simple, genuine expression of gratitude. And in that moment, it was the most powerful thing in the room. He had not only won Julian's money, he had won the argument without ever raising his voice, without another word. Elias picked up the instrument and walked towards the elevator. No one tried to stop him. No one asked for an autograph. They just watched him go, a humble man leaving a palace of arrogance with nothing but a worn-out guitar and a piece of paper. The elevator doors slid closed, and he was gone. The next morning, the world woke up to a new video. It had been filmed by one of the guests on their phone. The title was simple: "Billionaire bets musician $1 million he can't play this." The video was shaky, the audio not perfect, but it didn't matter. It captured everything: the arrogant setup, the smirking guests, the impossible instrument, and then the music. People all over the world watched, first with curiosity, then with rapt attention. They saw the faces of the crowd change from cynical to moved to tears. They saw the humble look on the billionaire's face. The video went viral in a matter of hours. News outlets picked up the story. Music critics wrote long articles about the performance, calling it the taming of the dissonance and a masterpiece of emotional storytelling. Elias was no longer just a musician. He was a symbol, a folk hero for the modern age. Back in his small apartment, Elias's phone would not stop ringing. It was a storm of offers he had never dreamed of. Record labels wanted to give him a contract. TV shows wanted to interview him. Famous musicians wanted to collaborate. He ignored it all. He had one call to make. He sat by the window, the check on the table in front of him, and dialed his sister's number. When she answered, her voice was bright and cheerful, as it always was. "Hey, you! I was just about to call you. How did your big project go?" He took a deep breath. "It went well," he said, a smile touching his lips. "Really, really well." He didn't go into the details. He just told her the news. "Remember that new treatment we talked about? The one the doctors were hopeful about? You don't have to worry about it anymore. I'm going to take care of everything." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. He could hear her breathing, small and shaky. Then he heard a soft sob. It wasn't a sob of sadness, but of pure, overwhelming relief. What did you do?" she finally whispered. "I just played some music," he said. In the months that followed, Elias did not become a celebrity. He turned down the major record deals and the TV appearances. He did, however, record one album. It was just him and the dissonance. It was a quiet, haunting, and beautiful album that sold millions. With all the proceeds going to a new foundation he started. The foundation was simple. Its mission was to provide music education and instruments to underfunded schools and community centers. He believed that every kid, no matter where they came from, should have the chance to find their voice, to discover the magic of creating something out of silence. One afternoon, he was at the grand opening of the first Elias Vance Music Center, in a neighborhood that looked a lot like the one he grew up in. It was a small, bright room filled with all kinds of instruments: guitars, drums, keyboards, and a few strange, unconventional ones that he had sourced from luthiers around the world. A group of kids were staring at the instruments with wide, wondering eyes. Elias didn't give a speech. He just walked over to a corner of the room and unwrapped the dissonance. He sat down on a small chair and began to play. The music was different this time. It wasn't full of struggle or sorrow. It was filled with hope, with the sound of new beginnings, with the quiet joy of a journey that had led him right back to where he needed to be. He played for the kids, for his sister, and for the quiet musician he used to be, playing in the corner of a room where no one was listening. He had learned that true mastery wasn't about conquering a challenge or winning a bet. It was about understanding. And the most valuable things in life, the things that truly mattered, could never be bought by a billionaire's arrogance. They had to be earned, one note at a time.